The answer to fear is not to cower and hide. It's not to surrender feebly without contest. The answer is to stand and face it boldly. Look at it, analyze it, and in the end, act. Eleanor Roosevelt. Welcome to the Conservation Project, the only podcast for the average Joe who still believes in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that we're still one nation under God. My name is Logan Bird, and welcome to the first episode. I'm kind of jumping right into things just because, well, I've got no time to waste, so let's just get into it. So, I want to start every episode with a quote. You're going to hear that every single time that you open up this podcast on whatever outlet you use, whether it be SoundCloud, Spotify, whatever it is. Apple Podcasts, you're going to hear a quote from the start, and you heard I just quoted Eleanor Roosevelt. The reason being is it's about fear, and I think in this day and age that means more than anything else does. We're surrounded by the fear of COVID, we're surrounded by the fear of the Taliban, we're surrounded by the fear of just about anything that any social media, political news outlet, whoever, they can throw it at you, and they can use this fear-mongering. That's part of the reason why I wanted to start this. And just to give a little background, as I mentioned, my name is Logan Bird. And about a year ago, me and my best friend had a conversation about exactly this. It was towards the start of COVID, and there was a lot of uncertainty involved in all of that. We didn't know where things were going. Everything was just stay at home, spend your time online playing games with your friends, because that was really the only social activity anybody was getting at that time, at least where I was at. And we had this conversation that led till about 2 or 3 in the morning where we talked about this exact thing. What do we do? And we just kept throwing Bible verses at each other. And we both come from this Christian conservative background. And funny enough, it's the main one that's really persecuted now more than anything else is. You know, you can go out into any realm and you can label yourself as whatever you want and you'll be accepted. Unless you stand for traditional family values, unless you stand for Christ. And that was where this whole thing started. We both came from blue-collar families. There's a lot of military in my family. I always wanted to join the military. My buddy Ben, he wanted to make something out of law school or some bigwig occupation, and God bless him, that's what he's doing, and I'm proud of him for it. And we had this conversation about if this is really the right path. And I had this conversation, and Lord knows my family and my loved ones have heard this conversation since I was probably 12 years old about wanting to join the military. Now, I'm in my early to mid-20s, and I'm not so sure that that's the answer anymore. I always thought military was going to be where I go. And my poor girlfriend has heard more than anything else that this is what I want to do. What do I need to do to make this happen? And then the back and forth because of all the things going on in this current administration. And it started really back when Ben and I had this conversation one late night where we talked about finding our fight and not being afraid. And that's where this quote from Eleanor Roosevelt came from. Because we wanted to find our fight. And I think over this last year, I've really learned that finding your fight, we're in the age of the fight is the pen rather than the sword. And I've always been around public speaking, writing, technical writing. It's just what I grew up around. And I will get to my background as far as my weird resume because it's weird, especially at a young age. But I come from a blue-collar background, and writing and music and speaking was a way to get your emotions out. And that's exactly what this is. And I started writing something a few weeks ago as this all really started to ramp up. I started writing this. I just let it flow. If in a moment of fear you choose to sit rather than stand, you have already lost. We live in a world where you have a choice. Sit idly by and let chaos roll forward, or stand and find your fight. This is not the cliche of it's good it's time for good men to do bad things, this is when men and women of conviction are called, without fear of persecution and without hesitation. If 300 Spartans could do it, surely thousands of us can too. So put on your armor and take up the mantle of those who gave it all. And it's funny because I wrote that right before things started to kick off in Afghanistan. And all I could think of was, so put on your armor and take up the mantle of those who gave it all. Because I was just mad. And that was the only emotion that I knew how to convey. And pretty much everyone around me caught the brunt of that. And that's when I really started to understand what this podcast was meant to be. This conversation that was over a year ago, this conversation between friends, family, loved ones, all of this. And it was leading up to something, and I couldn't put it to paper. I couldn't put it to words. I didn't know what that actually meant. But me, the impatient person that I am, the gotta have it now, gotta figure it out now, and if it doesn't, it's all broken person me, came to the understanding that I had to be patient. And this is one of the only things that I've been able to be patient in. Because I made a vow when I really started feeling that this was what I was being called to do right now. I didn't force anything. I didn't sit down and grind it out and figure it out. I let it happen. I let the Spirit move. I let things develop. I didn't sit down and research what the best this or that was for a podcast or these moments or that, whatever. I didn't do any of that. What I did do was pray on it. I used the people around me in my life who could give me the most solid advice, spiritual advice, trusted advice, and friendship to help me work through this and keep me at bay, because they know that was the biggest thing I had to do, was let it go. This wasn't for me. So that brings me to kind of my background. I'm just a normal person, and that's the important part, I believe, of this podcast. I have no credible background in politics. I have no credible background in the military. I'm not famous. I'm not a celebrity. I was a kid that went to work at 14 years old. And I'm the kid that grew up in a blue-collar area, and I went to the I went to the rich white kid school, and I was the poor white kid. That was what I knew growing up. And I always felt like I was destined for more, and I realize it's a very self-righteous way of looking at things and a very holier-than-thou perspective, but from a young age, I saw my parents do everything they could and break their back to give my family something more, to give me something more. And, I bounced around from job to job in high school. I worked hard for the most part, as much as a high school student has the capacity to do it, but towards the junior and senior year, things started to shrink down for me. I didn't know if I wanted to go to college, and here I am in my 5th year. I'm still around it. I'm still working. But with everything moving around, my heart just hurt. And it really started to break for me after the January 6th incident. And barring any politics for the moment being, the biggest thing that broke my heart is seeing our army surrounding the Capitol with barbed wire fences, and that hurt. Because the one thing I always wanted to do with my life was to be in that uniform with that backwards American flag on my right shoulder, and I wanted to march that march. I did. I wanted to be that person who was willing to take that on because I wanted to serve the nation that I felt so much for. Now, I still have that same mentality. I think it's just in a different capacity now. That's the purpose of this podcast. You heard the intro of it. It's the podcast for the average Joe who still believes in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the most important part of that is that we're still one nation under God, because that's the glue. That's the foundation. Everything builds up from there. That's how it started. And by God, that's how we're going to finish that. And I believe that. And that's where I take my stand. So regardless of that background or whatever, I just felt like this was the time where the pen really is mightier than the sword. Writing, speaking, using your words, using your vocabulary, standing up for what you believe in is the best fight that we can take right now. The Christian conservative group is the one that faces the most torment in the day-to-day, in the news streams, in the media, in social media. You go out in public, and unless you're in the Bible Belt, and even now that's starting to get a little blurry, it's still there. And it's getting worse, and people are choosing to sit rather than to stand. And I've done it myself. That doesn't make anybody a coward. What brings you down is not standing back up. When the waves knock you down, when the oceans crash against your life and the waves crash against your life, if you choose to stay down, then you've lost. You've got nowhere to go. And I think that's the most important part of where we stand as a nation right now. You can choose to sit, you can choose to stand. Thank God we still have the choice for that, but we're rapidly losing it. That's the purpose of this podcast. Normal people are what make this nation great. There's a reason the middle class has always made this nation great. Because we're the ones that go to the polls. We're the ones that vote with our feet, that vote with our dollar. That's what matters. You know, I listen to podcasts like Ben Shapiro's podcast and all sorts of stuff, cleared hot, fill in the blank. And the one thing I've always noticed is that it always comes from a perspective of one thing or another. Naturally, everybody's got agendas, everybody's got biases, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I'm not. For crying out loud, the name of the dadgum podcast is The Conservation Project, is about preserving Christian conservative values. However, the one thing that always really bugged me about things like Shapiro's podcast, and this is no disrespect to anybody, is that at some point I get so down in it. It's hard to sit here and listen to all the bad that's in the nation or in the world. It's hard to focus on the bad and still stay positive. The average person doesn't want to hear that. They can only take so much of it. You know, I've got something I always go back to, and I use this phrase constantly, and it's kind of become a running joke, but I always say I'll die on this hill because I'm a passionate person. I talk too much, therefore podcast. It just made sense. But I feel like in a world where you have a choice to sit or stand, where chaos, like Sun Tzu said, in the midst of chaos, there's also opportunity. And sometimes it's about standing up. We're going to get into more of that. This is just an intro podcast. This first episode is all going to be background. It's all going to be how things are going to work, what to expect moving forward. Tomorrow, I'm recording a much bigger podcast with a buddy of mine who is far more credible than I am in any of the stuff I'm going to talk about, and I want him around for this because this is going to be right on track with what we're going to talk about. But I've always said I'll die on this hill. And I think now it means absolutely more than ever. Because for us, under the mantle of Christian conservatives, especially Christians, I've always heard we are lions and we are lambs. And it's true. Because sometimes you have to die to yourself. That's biblical. But sometimes you gotta stand for yourself. You got to stand for what you believe. You are the lion. We are the lions. When you find that there is no dichotomy in that statement, but there's actually unity in it, you create a very monochrome way of looking at it, and you get purpose. Now, if you base your purpose off the foundation which we discussed earlier, Christ will take you there. And I think for us in that realm, we know that. But this whole time, especially recently, it's just had me in my head. It's had me pondering. And I'm going to end every episode with a Bible verse. Every episode is going to start with a quote. It's going to end with a quote. But this one I'm going to throw a little bit more out at you because these are things that I've had on my mind this entire time. Specifically a John F. Kennedy quote. And I think this really lines up to the I'll die on this hill mentality. Today we need a nation of Minutemen. Citizens who are not only prepared to take arms, but citizens who regard the preservation of freedom as the basic purpose of their daily life, and who are willing to consciously work and sacrifice for that freedom. That's John F. Kennedy. That's one of the main things that's been on my mind throughout this whole endeavor. Like I said, the whole thing going on with Afghanistan, I've got military family, and right now they're hurting. I've got friends with military family. I have friends who are military. They're hurting. But one thing I realized, people are hurting in general. And I chose that this is the hill I'm going to die on. Because sometimes you have to stand for people that can't stand for themselves. And it's a ripple effect. It's a domino effect. If you stand, you might inspire somebody else to. That's where it matters. And the biggest thing, for some reason, early on when all this started to formulate, when I started to get this and started to let things flow, and I'm proud to say, as of right now, that every single piece of this podcast, the planning, the formation, every bit of it has not been forced, has been spirit-led, has been natural. Nothing has been coerced, overly researched or studied, but has been brought to a specific place at a specific time. And, you know, I was, through the beginning of it, for some reason, I kept hearing Into the Valley of Death rode the 600. It's Charge of the Light Brigade, Alfred Tennyson. And I'm going to do something that I'm probably not going to do much of. I'm going to read the first half of this, because I believe this is important for where we stand. And then when I read this first half, I'm going to read a literary breakdown. And there's no better way of putting it. So I'm going to read this first half. Half a league, half a league, half a league onward. All in the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the light brigade, charge for the guns, he said. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the light brigade. Was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew someone had blundered. There's not to make reply. There's not to reason why. There's but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon in front of them. Volleyed and thundered, stormed it with shot and shell. Boldly they rode and well. Into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell rode the 600. See, from the start of this, when things started to really get into the planning phase for me on this, when I really felt things moving, I only had "There's but to do and die." Into the valley of death rode the 600. Boldly they rode and well. Into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell rode the 600. See, we have this mentality these days where we think that there's only a few of us. And this is just not true. The charge of the Light Brigade was the 600 cavalrymen that rode for 1.5 miles into the Valley of Death. Light Brigade advance, charge for the artillery, their commander said, so the 600 cavalrymen charged into the Valley of Death. Light Brigade advance, the commander said. Was there any soldier discouraged or afraid? No. Even though they all knew the charge was a mistake, but it wasn't up to them to dispute their orders or ask why they were given. Their job was simply to act and to die. The 600 members of the cavalry charged into the Valley of Death. There were cannons on their right, cannons on their left, cannons in front, and they all fired loud blasts. The soldiers were showered with gunshots and artillery shells, but they rode boldly and well into the teeth of death. The 600 soldiers rode into hell itself. Now, you can't tell me that there is no greater riding, no greater metaphor than 600 men riding into battle, knowing that the outcome could be entirely negative and they could die in the place they stand for the greatest cause that those men would ever serve. See, the charge of the Light Brigade was British light cavalry against Russian forces during the Battle of Balaclava in October of 1854 during the Crimean War. It was a total Russian victory. 6 weeks after this event, That's when Alfred Lord Tennyson's poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, was written. And that was all I can think. And for the last several weeks, as we've seen rises in COVID cases, rises in vaccination mishaps, people hurt, and this has happened in my family. I've had good and bad of every single part of what I'm going to talk about. And tomorrow we're going to get into vaccines. We're going to get into COVID. We're going to get into the heavy stuff. Tomorrow's when things really are going to start moving. In episode 2, things are really going to get to what this podcast is going to be. But I felt it necessary to bring up the Charge of the Light Brigade right now, because I'll die on this hill is not something that I've chosen to throw around. I've said that phrase for years and never knew what it meant. But as the Charge of the Light Brigade, I've been hearing for the last several weeks that there really are more of us than there are of them. And I never really thought of it in those terms until I started to hear other people speak about it, and then other people speak about it, and then more people, and it was a domino effect. Then you get on social media and you see that there are other people that are speaking this same language as this. I thought I was in an alienated group that refused to stand, where I was in the actual group that wanted more than anything to stand. Like I said, if 300 Spartans could do it, surely thousands of us can too. That's what this podcast is going to be about. It's going to be about more than bashing this administration, praising the last. You will never hear that out of me. I will critique whatever needs to be critiqued, but I will do so respectfully. I will never berate one group. I will never talk down one group. There's no gain in that. And I said from the start that this would be based around a biblical foundation, which is why every time you're going to get a quote to think about at the start, and you're going to get a Bible verse to finish on, something to dwell on. And I think that's the most important thing that we can do. Because this is the podcast for the average Joe. Everybody who goes to work and works their 9 to 5, sits behind their desk, goes home. Or if they're out, like my old background, they're plumbing. That's where I came from. And that's a hard job. There's harder. But I started young. And that was difficult. And that's okay, because it taught me to do exactly what I'm doing now. And that's stand up for myself. Because I spent so much time in the last 6 months wondering how we got here. Why are we here? Why does it feel like things are falling around all around us? Why does it feel like the walls of Jericho? And I realized that there was no greater time to stand up for what I believed than right now. So I let faith take it. So I'm going to wrap on this. And I really want to give this 1 Timothy 6:12. I want this to be what we close on. Fight the good fight of the faith. Take hold of the eternal life to which you were called, and about which you made the good confession in the presence of many witnesses. That's 1 Timothy 6:12. I felt that was the most necessary ending I could give. Fight the good fight of faith. For those that still believe in the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that we are one nation under God.